and we will have Niklas Selberg, the Associate Professor at the University of Lund, and last but not least, Sissel Trygstad, Deputy Director at Fafo. And this session will be followed by a Q&A session, actually. Then very quickly, the second panel today will be on the will focus on the topic of decent work and the necessity to codify legally democracy at work, starting with the example of due diligence. It will be moderated by Carmen Barrera Camoro, who was our rapporteur for the opinion of decent work worldwide. And here we will have with us Lieve Verboven, the director from the ILO for the Benelux and the European Union, and also Isabelle Schömann, Confederal Secretary of the ETUC, will be with us. Colleagues, before giving the floor to Aurelio, I just wanted to say a few words. I think we all agree that democracy at work is the core of trade union action, and it is a fundamental value for us as trade unions, but I think also for the European model. And therefore, we were really pleased when we traveled in June to Spain, and we met a lot of representatives of the Spanish government, that it seems that this topic is also important for the Spanish government. Does it work? Yeah. Does not work? Now it works. Okay, there's some issues with the micro, but yeah, okay. Yeah. We will see, we will listen then to Aurelio, but we would be very happy if this would be one of the priorities during the Spanish presidencies. Because, and here I will make my last remark, we are all facing we were facing and still facing two unprecedented crises. Of course, the COVID-19 crisis with all its consequences, and recently the war against Ukraine with the partial breakdown of supply chains, and also as a key driver for inflation and its high impact on energy markets, energy and food markets worldwide. And if we try as trade unions to share the burden of these challenges and of inflation, then I think we all agree that we need a strong participation of workers, of trade unions, and of civil society. And here, unfortunately, we have to see that already in the period before the war, we were experiencing a decrease in collective bargaining. We could observe attacks on collective bargaining systems. So I think one of the main priorities is really to strive for, again, strengthening collective bargaining systems and also systems of workers' participation. And therefore, I think it's a very good moment to have Aurelio with us from the Spanish Perm Rep. I just read recently a report that the number of unemployed people in October has dropped in Spain against the normal trend in October. And it was also reported that one main reason for this could be the labor market reforms and also the efforts of the Spanish government to strengthen again collective bargaining. We know that there were recently some labor market reforms, also with the participation of the Spanish colleagues of the Spanish trade unions. So therefore, in this light, we are really looking forward to start this debate with you. It's a cooperation at a very early stage, but I think it's the right moment already to see where we have fields of cooperation for your presidency. So once again, thank you very much, Aurelio, for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Muchas gracias, Oliver.
Thank you very much, Oliver. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to start by thanking you for inviting me and for giving me this opportunity representing the Spanish permanent representation to be here, albeit briefly, so that I can introduce some of our concerns and thoughts that are underpinning the work that we are doing in preparing the forthcoming Spanish presidency, which, as you know, will take place in the second half of next year. And I can confirm very clearly that democracy at work will indeed be one of the key priority themes for our presidency. And in fact, we would also agree that we do need to strengthen cooperation with the committee on these topics. And with that in mind, in the various reports that we will be requesting, or the various opinions that we will be requesting in support of our presidency, the first opinions that were suggested and that were presented focused specifically on these issues: democracy at work, enhancing collective bargaining in the context of the green transition, the climate transition. Clearly, these are very important issues which will form part of the political momentum that we'll be generating as part of the events that we'll be organising. And of course, we hope to work together very closely with the committee in so doing. Right. On the subject more generally, I don't think I'll be telling you anything new about it, because I'm sure you know more about it than we do, but democracy at work is something which we do intend to broach in the Spanish presidency from a broad perspective, a perspective with a number of dimensions to it. Obviously, perhaps the first thing that springs to mind is that we want to enhance the right for workers to participate in the company and collective bargaining agreements, and the rights of workers to participate in companies, bearing in mind the new ways of organisation, management and control within companies. Obviously, this is one of the important elements that we need to focus on in order to combine productivity on the one hand and prospects for work on a participatory basis. But alongside that, of course, there are other aspects to this which are very important too. One of which, of course, is genuine exercise of collective bargaining. Bearing in mind that the use of digital approaches within companies, digital methods, working methods, well, these are issues which mean that we can't water down the basic principles in workers' rights and collective bargaining. And that being the case, working on these issues in view of the challenges facing us mean that, among other things, perhaps we need to be more ambitious in our plans, because obviously we need to respond on a more supranational basis to issues which obviously we're working on at national level as well. And there's a third aspect to this as well, a third dimension, which is addressed in the second opinion that we requested, another important issue to our mind. And this relates to the implications ensuing from the green transition towards climate neutrality, focusing on the impact on employment, on jobs, cohesion, job creation, training, and so on and so forth. And the same goes for digitalization. There's been a lot in the way of general social debate across all policy areas, focusing on energy efficiency, decarbonization, the circular economy. And obviously, we're saying that we need to promote approaches which can ensure a fair, a just transition, to ensure that that is not left behind. And with that in mind, it's very important that we strengthen the role played by and the need for collective bargaining as part of these processes. So that's another of these main dimensions. And that is why we've requested these two opinions. That's why we've tabled these two requests. And we've also put forward some of the issues that we hope to discuss and debate next year. The current regulatory framework needs to be changed, in our view, when it comes to workers' rights to participate in the running of companies. It would be helpful to define a European framework for rights of participation. And we also need to take another look at the content and the representative functions of European works councils. And latching back to the 2009 collective bargaining agreement, how it can be strengthened, how we can strengthen collective bargaining, and what could be the real impact of the new technological means of monitoring and control within companies and the decision-making processes within companies as well, ensuring democracy at work, political participation, and workers' rights more generally in the workplace. And lastly, how can we ensure or help to ensure that we have better and more effective participation of workers and their representatives in the management and decision-making processes within companies regarding the whole of the green and just transition process? So that's really the core of what we intend to take forward, focus on, and debate at political level. Those are the main issues on which we hope to make headway. And of course, we'll be holding these debates in the councils of ministers. We'll hold a number of specific events in the course of our presidency. And as I said at the outset, we intend to do all this working very closely in cooperation with the committee and, of course, with your group as well. That's really all I wanted to say. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Aurelio. From my point of view, it's very promising, I have to say. Only those two opinions are key opinions for us as workers' group and as trade union movement. And you mentioned that they are also aiming at changing the regular framework. And I think this is especially important as we know that almost 90% of the action plan on the European Pillar of Social Rights are already tabled. So I think we need a new impetus to keep the momentum for social Europe. And I think your presidency will play a key role in this respect, definitely. And once again, we are really grateful for this initiative, and we will definitely deliver and contribute to this debate. So thank you very much for this opening. Then, colleagues, I would like to hand over to our chair for the first debate, which is Reiner Hoffman. And we have just quickly to change the seats because Reiner needs to see the monitor with all the colleagues connected remotely. So Reiner, you can take my seat, and then we will start with the first panel debate. If you want, you can stay, as you wish. I sit here next to you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Ja, liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen, auch
Dear colleagues, well, I too would like to wish you a very warm welcome to our meeting. I think it's really excellent. It's great that in the run-up to the Spanish presidency of the Council, our committee has been asked to prepare a number of measures focusing in particular on the subject of the worker's voice. And at this point, could I say that, of course, I have taken over the role of rapporteur on this exploratory opinion, and today, together, we have an opportunity to work on this in the coming weeks based on the meeting that we're having today. And so I think, as per the timetable, the idea is that next spring, next April, we should be able to go to the plenary with this opinion and get it adopted with plenty of support. I don't really want to say any more by way of a lengthy introduction, but just to sum up very briefly, perhaps, just picking up on what Mr. Fernández López has already said. I'm very pleased to hear the very precise questions that have been put to us, because, as we're all aware, the world of work is undergoing a huge change at the moment. Workers' rights, rights of participation, rights to collective bargaining have to continue to be developed as part of these transitions. We can't afford a standstill, given that the world of work is changing so quickly. If that's the case, then it's vital that we address those changes, we get to grips with them and ensure that we can strengthen workers' rights in this area. And based on experience in Germany, and I think this goes for many other EU member states too, it goes without saying that this is the case from the point of view of the trade unions, but unfortunately that's not always the case when it comes to a number of employers and certain governments. It's vital that we continue to develop and expand workers' rights. And as Mr. Fernandez has said, it's no longer enough, far from it, for us to guarantee workers' rights at national level, but rather we have a basic set of European rights as well, starting with the Directive on Information and Consultation, covering the whole issue of workers' rights in the case of mass redundancies, mass dismissals, protection of health at the workplace, but also the Directive on European Works Councils. In all these areas, we feel that there are huge needs for adjustment, and we intend to spell those out more precisely and address those issues in our opinion and formulate specific recommendations on them. And with that in mind, it's absolutely clear that as representatives of workers, we have an obligation to pursue the aim of ensuring that digitalization and decarbonization of our economies can be a success for our societies, for our companies, and for workers, because without a strong workers' voice, then we will not be successful in continuing to shape these transition and transformation processes. And in that context, I'm very glad that we've managed to get Rolf Schmachtenberg to come and provide us with some input from the point of view of the Federal Republic of Germany, but also the European dimension, which is tied up with this as well, so that following on from that, we will then hear from Niklas and Sissel, and we'll be able to hear their experiences, very specific experiences from European member states, but not just that. We'll also be able to look at the situation outside the EU, Norway in particular. And so I'd like to thank you very much indeed, Mr. Fernandez. Thank you for all the initiatives that you're taking in the run-up to the Spanish presidency. This is really excellent, and you're right in saying that it's vital that we ensure good cooperation with the EESC as the voice of civil society. That cooperation needs to be strengthened, and that, after all, is our main concern. So a big thank you for that. Well, I hope that Rolf Schmachtenberg is now connected and has been able to follow the debate so far, and I'm assuming that the technical side of things is prepared and that the technicians will be able to give Rolf the floor. So thank you, Rolf, for taking the time to address the meeting. You have the floor.
Could you please just press button speak? Thank you.
Jetzt vielleicht?
Is it working now? Yes.
Yes.
Liebe Mitglieder des
Dear members of the EESC, ladies and gentlemen, dear Oliver Rübke, Reiner, and Aurelio Fernández López, thank you very much for inviting me to take part in these fundamental considerations regarding participation of workers and to be able to say a few words of explanation. It was a good decision that the workers group within the EESC and the Workers' Voice Interest Group for Workers' Participation was convened. In their view, it's vital that they show that they want to be more than an internal market, and in that respect I can only concur 100%. And I'd very much like to thank our Spanish colleagues, represented by Aurelio Fernández López. Thank you, Spain, for having taken the initiative in the run-up to the Spanish presidency of involving the EESC in the preparations, because the economic and social dimension must be taken into account in shaping EU policies. As part of the European social model, co-determination of workers at company and workers' council level, and a stronger partnership. Well, those two elements have also marked the social economy in Germany to a significant degree, and that continues to be the case. And they've shown themselves to be fairly resilient to crisis as well. Without a good social partnership at European level and within the member states, it would be inconceivable that certain progress could be made at European level. Workers' participation and co-determination is enshrined at European level. The European social framework and the implementation thereof is a very important part of this process across the board in Europe. And as part of the European Commission's work programme for 2023 that I looked at last week, dated the 18th of October 2022, that clearly highlights this issue, as does the social agenda that was adopted in Porto in May of 2021. So there's a clear commitment on the part of the Commission there to work on an ongoing basis, and they're already on it, as it were. They're already on the case. So perhaps I could say a little bit about workers' participation or co-determination in Germany. Well, this is living democracy in the workplace, and it has been in operation over many decades, and it stood the test of time. It serves as the basis for the economic success and the relatively high level of social care in Germany. And the value of workers' co-determination is borne out at a time of crisis, and recently we've had more than enough of those to grapple with. So clearly companies are more resilient to crisis if there is a high level of co-determination and participation. And workers' councils are really step in as managers at a time of crisis, because it provides an opportunity for the various stakeholders to discuss, but I think this has been made abundantly clear in the pandemic as well. Works councils have helped to ensure that proper protection can be implemented at company level, and that opportunities for part-time work can be availed of, and that it's been possible to reconcile working and family life, the work-life balance at a time of crisis. And workers who are represented by a works council are far more frequently able to work from home or be able to obtain training during the pandemic than was the case with those working in companies without works councils. Okay, fair enough. There may be another correlation behind that. It may be based on the size of the companies or whatever. It may well be that a lot of SMEs don't have works councils, but nonetheless, I think that is an indication that worthy of mention. Something else that we observe is that workers' participation also has a positive effect on gender equality in the workplace, and the same goes for the digital, social and green transitions. Workers' participation and co-determination has a significant role to play, and the well-known 3 Ds in German, digitalization, decarbonization and demographic change, form the 3 long waves which are shaping our society within Europe and far beyond it as well, come to that currently. And these are the main challenges facing us and which will continue to face us in the future. And this means that companies need to be highly innovative and able to adapt. And works councils can help to ensure that companies are fit and resilient and able to retain workers and keep jobs, and helping to play a more active role in promoting workers' health and ensuring that workers can be as healthy as possible and remain in work for as long as possible. And as part of the digital transition, workers' councils play an important role in shaping these processes and also helping to overcome the consequences of the transition on workers and the sometimes adverse consequences that this can give rise to. And the example of digitalization specifically shows that work within organization and if changes take place in the day-to-day organization and the day-to-day life of workers, it's vital that the workers are involved in order to ensure that fair compromises can be reached. Ultimately, it's not in the workers' interests if there's a bad atmosphere in a company and there's poor communication and if they don't understand what's going on. And works councils really have a huge role to play in this area. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'd also like to say a little bit about co-determination as part of EU policy. In the treaty, it was agreed that at European level we would wish to enhance workers' participation, and in particular we want to ensure that there are no opportunities to circumvent workers' participation, as can sometimes be the case when a single company is set up at European level, an SE, and we have made it clear in Germany that this is a huge problem. It's a huge phenomenon, and it's very painful to see the consequences of this over recent years. And with that in mind, it is vital, it's a matter of urgency that we have a framework directive laying down uniform European standards for workers' participation. And the European Parliament submitted an initiative opinion on the workplace, and this was picked up on and promoted by ministers in their 2020 declaration. And within the EESC, thank goodness, you are very keen for the discussion to continue on a framework directive laying down minimum standards for workers' voices being heard and workers being properly informed and represented in management and decision-making bodies. As per the opinion, no Green Deal without a social deal. This was made abundantly clear in that opinion. And the EESC is in favour of ensuring that the directive is better in line with the current situation regarding national restructurings and the like. And additional resources need to be made available. And the same goes for penalties being applied to companies which fail to comply with the current provisions. And in this regard, we're closely monitoring developments regarding a proposal for an opinion on a directive on European Works Councils in the European Parliament. We'll have to see how that goes and how the European Commission responds to it. And one very important stage on the way towards ensuring greater workers' co-determination and participation is the European directive where we focus on minimum wages. Here we're saying that we don't only want fair wages, but fair collective bargaining processes, and we're very keen as part of this process to ensure that workers and social partners can be given a fair legal framework, because that's the best way of putting this into practice. And I was delighted to see the very broad majority in the Council and the European Parliament in favour of this directive when it's adopted, and I think that pays tribute to Europeans working together. This was a great success, and of course we'll need to maintain that. We'll need to keep the momentum going. And I'd just like to say something from the point of view of a representative of a company, looking at your second panel discussion, decent work and the need for democracy at work being properly codified. Looking at the example of the company's obligation of care and due diligence, and this question of diligence is becoming increasingly relevant. And that being the case, it's vital that the voice of workers is heard and addressed. And looking at the duty of diligence as part of the European supply chains. Yes, that's right. The legislation on the duty of diligence in the supply chains, it's a very long compound word in German, and the speaker had a bit of trouble with it. But anyway, we amended the European constitutional law in order to ensure that companies comply with their duty of diligence and the right to provide information, and this was agreed to in the Economic and Social Committee. And we intend to implement this as part of European legislation on the supply chain, but it's vital that workers are involved at European level when it comes to the duty of care and diligence in the supply chain. So, ladies and gentlemen, drawing to a close now, I don't have much time, and we need to ensure that we make good use of the meeting time. These are our specific concerns regarding the question of democracy at work on the European policy agenda. It's vital that this can be given more priority than has been the case hitherto, and I hope that this will be a great success, and I hope that in the interests of workers within Europe there will be more democracy in the workplace, and that will help to counteract the rising nationalism and populism, because that will ensure that the social cohesion of our societies can be strengthened. Thank you very much indeed for giving me this opportunity to speak to you today, and thank you for your attention.
Auch dir, lieber Rolf, ganz
Well, thank you very much indeed, Rolf, for your input. Not only from the perspective of the national situation in Germany, but you've also clearly addressed the European challenges and referred to those, and also the legal opportunities that we already have today, but the possibilities which have recently been created as well. And could I underscore once again that we did succeed in the European directive on the minimum wage, not just in ensuring the minimum wage at European level, but also the collective bargaining agreement being raised to 80%, and that's a very important concern of ours in the committee. And for member states failing to meet that target, they have to submit action plans indicating how they intend to achieve that collective bargaining target. That, I believe, is a really key element when it comes to the workers' voice. And the second point I'd like to highlight is this. It's something clearly mentioned by Rolf as well, explaining why the value of workers' participation and collective bargaining agreements is so important, because part of that value is that in times of multiple crises, it helps to make businesses more resilient. That is our main concern as well. And just something that I would like to add, something I didn't quite catch, but I think this is in the treaty, but it's also in the European Commission's proposal on the term workers. At a time of digital platform work, it's important that we make more progress on this at European level as well. And I very much hope that in the second half of 2023, it will be possible, working together with the Spanish presidency, to ensure an acceptable European solution to this, because national rules and regulations addressing the question of platform work and the definition of the term workers will not be enough. So thank you very much, Rolf. Well, it's the first time that you've addressed the EESC, and you're always very keen to focus on questions of workers' rights, and you're known for your very close cooperation with the committee. It's not the first time you've addressed us, of course, so a big thank you for that. So, Oliver, we will now have some input from Volker Telljohann, who's been working for many years as a researcher in the Ires in Italy. And we'd agreed, Volker, that you would perhaps tell us a little bit about some of the experience that you've gained in your research work in recent years based on European comparison. And that clearly goes beyond the experience of individual countries. So I'm happy to give you the floor. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. Would it be possible to share my presentation?
Could you please send it to us? Very quickly. I think it will be difficult from your side to share it now.
Okay. Yes, okay. So then, yes, so I think it's not so important. Then I will do it. I will just, let's say, present it, and I think it will be possible for you to follow me also without seeing the presentation. So with regard to the integration of the economic and social dimension of the European Union, the EWCs are, according to me, the major institution with regard to democracy at work, able to promote such an integration. And that's the reason why I will focus on the role of EWCs here in my presentation. So the integration between the economic and social dimension is of particular importance in view of the transformation processes that are already well underway. At European level, effective employee participation is needed with regard to digital and ecological transformation, with regard to reorganization of value chains due to pandemic, and also with regard to the need for due diligence in supply chains. In this process of fundamental change, worker participation is so important because it favors sustainable and long-term strategies. With regard to these challenges, EWCs are of growing importance as we are speaking about company strategies that are decided at a central level. And so there's a growing need for information and consultation at European level with regard to digitalization and the introduction of AI systems, with regard to changes in work organization, with regard to new forms of work supervision, and also with regard to the assessment and recruitment of workers. So, as I said, EWCs can be considered the nucleus of European industrial relations. The fact that there are today about 1,200 active EWCs must be considered a success, but this says little about their effectiveness. In practice, EWCs lack the necessary resources and competences. And even the recast directive contributed only to a limited extent to better functioning. And the involvement of EWCs in many cases is only a mere formality with limited impact, especially with regard to transnational restructuring processes. So that means that the EWC directive has to better match current and future needs of transnational restructuring. So the trade union involvement in EWCs, according to me, is one of the most critical aspects, as there is still resistance to trade union involvement on the part of the management. That is a problem because research has shown that EWCs function better where a trade union coordinator exists. These EWCs in general have more internal meetings, more training, and more communication with the local level. So that means that there would be a need for a clearly defined right for trade union experts to participate in the EWC and select committee meetings and to have access to all sides. Such a right would also help to strengthen the supporting and coordinating role of trade unions and improve articulation between the European and local levels. Another problem regards the involvement of EWCs in transnational matters. Only 1/5 of EWC members that participated in a research project of the ETUI said that they are informed and consulted before final decisions are taken. And at the same time, there are serious deficiencies in enforcement. The sanctions have shown to be not effective. So that means that there would be a need for dissuasive sanctions. And what is also important is to stress that sanctions defined at national level need to be aligned. as they should ensure a level playing field. The most important sanction in this context should be the prohibition on management implementing a decision before proper information and consultation has taken place. With regard to the anticipation and management of change, so here we have another crucial challenge for EWCs. Also in this regard, the quality of EWC involvement can be considered insufficient because EWC meetings in general serve predominantly for information, but not for real consultation. Furthermore, the quality of information is insufficient. So there would be a need to improve the quality of information and to widen the scope of topics to be discussed. There's also a need for sufficient resources in terms of time, money, and expertise for the EWCs. And EWCs should also be guaranteed comprehensive right to be informed and consulted throughout the decision-making processes. This includes also the right of an EWC to deliver its opinion before consultation is concluded at the different levels. Another challenge regards the access to justice for EWC. So there is a lack of clear rules on the legal status of EWCs and the means available to EWCs in legal proceedings. So there's a need to specify the legal status of EWCs and SNBs as legal actors in order to ensure their access to justice. And there's also a need to define the legal means to initiate legal action in defense of rights conferred by the EWC directive. So to conclude, I will just list some further demands that are important in order to improve the functioning of EWCs, and these demands regard, for example, the need to broaden the definition of controlling undertaking. It regards the need to put an end to exemption of voluntary pre-directive agreements. It regards the need for a clear obligation of central management to establish an EWC if subsidiary requirements are to apply. And it regards the need for a clear definition of confidentiality rules in order to guarantee access to information and effective participation. And finally, it regards also the need for strengthening of the subsidiary requirements in order to improve the practical functioning of the EWC. So, with regard to the next session, I of course do not want to anticipate that session, but I just would like to stress that with regard to the proposal for EU directive on due diligence, it would be necessary to include also EWCs in the definition of stakeholders, and to involve EWCs in the development, management, and monitoring of company due diligence provisions. So I would like to conclude saying that only if employee representatives can participate effectively, participation will also produce important side effects like the acceptance and legitimacy of transformative changes, which are important drivers of employees' motivation, performance, and productivity. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much to you, dear Volker, for this presentation and especially focusing on the need for an update of the EWC directive. This was one of the precise questions the Spanish presidency has addressed, and we will certainly make use of the research findings to have also political conclusion to have an update or a revision, not only a recast of the directive, soon as possible. We move further, and I'm very pleased that Niklas Selberg is connected with us to give us his presentation from the University of Lund. Dear Niklas, thanks for joining us, and you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. So thank you, Oliver Röpke and Reiner Hoffman, for the invitation to address this group and to add to your super important work. And my best regards to Norbert Kluge, the fierce trade unionist. I know him from before. So I am a Swedish labor lawyer. I can by no means take credit for the Swedish system. I am a student of it. I have the pleasure of being a student of it, and I will try to describe democracy at work from the Swedish point of view and try to add to the group by fleshing out what has proven to be fruitful lines of argumentation in the Swedish context. And so my focus will be to add to the wonderful texts already produced and try to complement them. So this is about complementing them and not about sort of disagreeing with them. And because of time restraints, I have to be very selective and brief. So here goes then. The time is ripe, I think, for this discussion. Industrial citizenship discussions has always followed extreme pressures on workers and citizens in the world wars, and today we have the invasion of Ukraine and the post-pandemic state we are in. In academia, we see an increase in interest in democracy at work, and on the labor market, we see sharpening of conflicts, even in US. We are talking about Amazon workers and baristas and what have you. I think the discussion about democracy at work in member states or on state level, this discussion, democracy at work, is often the superstructure on social conflicts regarding pay. And that is not quite possible on the pan-European level. So I think when we approach this subject, we need to start the discussion in principles and lofty ideas and subsequently focus on technical issues. And that is sort of the gist of my presentation here today. So I think then we should focus not only on the instrumental arguments for democracy at work. I think you state the business case for democracy always eloquently and elegantly and well argued and well reasoned. But that should also be complemented by the intrinsical arguments and focus on what is good with democracy at work as such, even though it did not lead to better decisions. And the core of the argument is that democracy is essentially about decoupling rights, for example, to self-government from the possession of property. So you want to distribute rights to self-government to along the lines of equality to everybody affected, and not on the lines of to those who possess property, the shareholders. And this can be blurred if democracy at work is supported solely by the business case. So I think having said that, I will immediately add other instrumental arguments to the discussion. I want to mention the spillover effect mentioned in the literature, mentioning that authoritarian workplaces weakens people's dispositions that are important to democratic citizenship. So democratizing work supports political democracy, which we are in dire need of today. We see still the effects of Trumpism and Bolsonaro, and well, Sweden also had general elections only recently, and we are still grappling about that. So democratizing work is supporting political democracy. Furthermore, we see that increased voice in organization increases loyalty to the organization, and this favors continuity of service. This is particularly important, for example, in the public sector. Nurses, for example, they love their work. They are super loyal, but they feel that they must leave because they are being essentially harassed by management, making their working conditions insufferable. So they leave. If they were able to voice their complaint, they would be prone to stay. My intrinsic argument then, what I'm asking for, is to highlight a lot the idea of the labor investors. We know that shareholders organize collectively in the corporation, but we also see that workers invest in the enterprise, and their investment is not only monetary and financially, it's of a personal nature. They invest their sweat and their body. As you know, labor cannot be distinguished from the person carrying it. So selling labor power is a truly personal transaction. And the performance of workers is governed by rules set by the enterprise. And another key starting point is that the enterprise needs labor and capital equally. So following this standpoint, workers should be represented collectively in the enterprise and be granted rights to self-government. Another intrinsic argument is about the understanding of employer. We see a lot of legal developments, the ideas about corporate social responsibility, corporate sustainability due diligence, whistleblowing, the Paris Accord, and so on, where we can argue now that employing someone is assuming a quasi-public role. And on the following that, we could argue that corporations should be understood analogous to states. So the justifications for political democracy are relevant also for the workplace. Furthermore, I kind of miss in some of the text an expansion on the already existing human rights discourse in Europe, where the European Court of Human Rights have stated some time ago now that the members of a trade union have a right, in order to protect their interests, that the trade union should be heard. And this is followed by subsequent cases where it's stated that the union and its members must be free in one way or another to seek to persuade the employer to listen to what it has to say on behalf of its members. And the court has also clearly stated that trade union rights are subject to evolution depending on particular developments in labor relations. And of course, I know that the case law of the Human Rights Court is a mixed bag, but there is definitely some arguments to flesh out from the court's case law. I also want to mention that sectoral collective bargaining is key to the discussions about democracy at work. As we all know, collective bargaining decommodifies work and supports workers. We also know that equality is a necessary component of democracy. And collective bargaining, if it's carried out on industry level, it provides equality across workplaces. Terms and conditions for work and health and safety standards, etc., are the same without regard to who the employer is. So this is a truly democratic concept, and therefore I see dangers in decoupling demands for participation and social dialogue on the one hand from collective bargaining, subsequently or in the last instance supported by strikes and industrial actions from each other. Furthermore, sectoral collective bargaining has proven to be instrumental in implementing structural change on the labor market. Today, we see the need to decarbonize industry, and it's also proven to be a way of removing and attacking low-wage sectors in its entirety. So, what would be the starting points for European agenda on this matter? Much have been said already, and I agree fully with it. I just want to mention that the technical side of this, we can use benchmark of solutions in member states as inspiration for technical solutions. I think we need to address the constitutional, the treaty space for democracy at work. It's not entirely clear, especially if we emphasize the fact that rights to organize, rights to information and negotiation, collective bargaining, and industrial action and employment protection are inseparable. Then we will eventually have a sort of problem with the constitutional space for the concept of democracy at work. Furthermore, I think we cannot skip out on focusing on the idea of European or international collective bargaining agreements, and they raise a number of hurdles from private international law regarding sort of the definition of a collective bargaining agreement, but also their legal effects in different states. Furthermore, EU labor law and the enforcement of EU labor law is highly focused on the individual worker, which risks marginalizing trade unions and collective representation. Everything is relative here. This is truly a Swede speaking to you now. And lastly, on the European agenda, a challenge from EU labor law, which is quite detailed and mandatory. So the scope for bargaining becomes narrow, and this is essentially disincentivizing employers from engaging in collective bargaining. So, and this is the key issue as I see it, how to both ideologically and materially incentivize both workers and employers to take part in a system for democracy at work. Finally, I want to just mention that the degree of continuity, in my opinion, is quite high. These are the industrial conflict, the manifestations in the Lapland area of the utmost northern part of Sweden, 1969, that sparked the process that led to the Swedish Codetermination Act. And their key cry was, "We are not machines. We will prevail, and we are firm in our demands." And these are, of course, we are not robots, we are humans, respect us. Those are the sort of key, the essential outcries from contemporary labor market protests. So this was my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much to you, dear Niklas, for your fruitful contribution. And I think at least I got from your presentation to make crystal clear that workers' voice and the democratization of work will contribute significantly also to the political democracy, which is at risk based on the major challenges we are facing. I think we shouldn't underestimate the role for the political democracy, which will contribute from workers' rights and workers' voice. And the second point, and I think this was very similar to what Volker Telljohann said, we should be very clear to strengthen also the role of trade unions in the concept of workers' voice. Without trade unions, I think workers' voice is not or has only a limited capacity, so that we have to take into consideration to strengthen workers' rights as well as strengthening the role of trade unions either in the European Works Councils Directive or at national level. These are two aspects I like to underline. Now we are moving to the next speaker, Sissel Trygstad from Fafo in Norway. Dear Sissel, many thanks for joining us, especially also to have a contribution from Europe, but not from the European Union, which would be quite interesting to listen to you, Sissel. You have the floor.
Thank you so much for inviting me to this very important meeting. And before I give you an idea of how democracy at work unfolds in Norway through sociological lenses, I need to give you some numbers about the Norwegian labor market. We are a small country, and the labor market consists of 2.7 million, and the employment rate is 66%. It is 69 among men and 64 among women. And women have a high level of employment due to generous welfare state arrangements, such as preschools and daycare facilities for school children, and gender equality is high up on the agenda in general. Norway has an open economy, which is exposed to international competition, and compared to most other countries, the wages and the competence among the workers are high, and the reorganization process are frequent. The public and private service sector make up the majority of jobs, and the importance of traditional manufacturing is decreasing. And when it comes to what is essential for workplace democracy, we have rather strong and independent trade unions and employer associations. Half of the employees are unionized, and the overall bargaining coverage is 70%, but with clear sector differences. In public sector, all are covered, but in private sector, 50% are covered by a collective agreement. We have no minimum wage, but we have a system of generally applicable collective agreements. It is important to keep the bargaining coverage at a high level to secure a solid wage floor, and it is essential for workplace democracy. Workplace democracy can be justified by two normative arguments: because it is efficient and because it is fair. And these arguments are actually reflected in the laws and agreements in Norway. And one important milestone was the basic agreement between the peak organizations in 1935, labeled as the Constitution of the Working Life, which gives rules of cooperation and co-determination at company level. Statutory law and collective agreements set the framework for participation and give shop floors and health and safety representatives access to formal and informal meetings where relevant topics are discussed among the parties. And you will find similar arrangements between all confederations in Norway. The Working Environment Act states that all companies with 10 employees or more shall have an elected health and safety representatives, and companies with 50 or more shall have a Working Environment Committee. Statutory law also regulates employee board representatives and European Work Council, as well as co-determination rights in big companies. And then we have the rights and obligation of the collective agreements, which give the shop stewards some obligations as well as rights. And it is give rules for the presence at different companies at different levels within the company and among group of companies. And in addition, there will often be a wide range of more informal or ad hoc forums where the parties meet in companies covered by a collective agreement. While there are some thresholds when it comes to when a company must have different arrangements laid down in laws and agreements, the basic agreements state when and how often the parties should meet regardless of company size. And it says that the management shall discuss issues with shop stewards, and I quote, matters related to the financial position of the enterprise, its production and its development, matters immediately related to the workplace and everyday operation, and general wage and working condition at the enterprise. Unless otherwise agreed, discussions shall be held as early as possible and at least once a month, and otherwise whenever requested by the shop steward. So the question is then whether the basic agreement is actually followed in Norwegian companies. I will use survey data and address 3 questions. What explain differences when it comes to shop stewards' participation? To what degree does participation matter when it comes to how shop stewards judge their own influence over decisions concerning the company and their members? And does participation actually matter when it comes to the workers' everyday life? I will focus on most different cases, manufacturing and part of private service sector, and the 2 sectors differs along some important features. The bargaining coverage in manufacturing is rather high, but moderate to low in private service sector, and the union density follows the same pattern. In private service sector, we also find a high share of atypical work and a high turnover rate among employees. So, do the shop steward actually have informal and formal discussions with the management at their level about issues concerning the company and the members? According to our survey, around 42% participate in both formal and informal discussions and talks with their manager. 14% have just formal talks, while 15% have just informal talks, and a quite big share, 29%, have neither nor. While those who participate formally and informally match our perception of the Norwegian model of labor relations, the situation is quite opposite for those who do not participate at all. And we label this as a participation gap. Participation depends on the parties' willingness and interest in following the rules and regulations. And we find that industry make a difference. If we look at those shop stewards who do not participate at all or seldom participate, we find that a majority work in private service sector. And remember that the union density and the collective agreement coverage are rather low in this sector. And then the question, does participation make any difference when it comes to influence? Our research question number 2, and the simple answer is yes. We have asked shop stewards the following question: do you have any influence in question concerning your members and the company? And our data clearly demonstrate a gradual decrease of influence from those who participate in both formal and informal meetings to those who only participate formally, and then to those who participate only informally, and at last those who do not participate at all. And then we have 1 question left. Does shop steward participation make any difference when it comes to how the employees experience their daily life in the company? When we in surveys ask how employees assess their influence on job-related decisions, such as how to do their job or the possibility to have an impact upon the speed, we find a rather strong correlation between influence on these issues and the presence of different participatory arenas inside the company. The more arenas there are for shop steward participation, the stronger this influence is considered to be, and of course the other way around. And further, we find that those who consider their manager as supportive and inclusive also work in organizations with several arenas where the management and the shop stewards meet. And 1 more thing, when it comes to new form of digital control and monitoring of employees, the workers shall have a say and privacy considerations should be taken into account when the management are introducing new control measures in the companies. However, we know that the employers do not always follow the rules. And our analysis shows that employees who work in enterprises with a collective agreement, with a shop steward present, and or a health and safety representatives, to a greater extent say that new digital systems are discussed with employees, shop steward, or safety representatives or other, compared to those who work in companies without. So workplace democracy is highly dependent on collective agreements and the presence of shop stewards and health and safety representatives at the workplace. So a decrease in collective agreements coverage and new forms of businesses and a new form of employment may challenge this model. So I think I will stop there. Thank you for the attention.
Thanks also very much to you, Sissel, for your contribution. And I think it was important, at least I understood that we should look also to small and medium-sized companies, since we have a number of thresholds in the national law which to some extent exclude small and medium-sized companies, or they have weaker possibilities for workers' involvement. And here again, based on your research finding that trade union density as well as high coverage of collective bargaining is always important to strengthen workers' voice in the world of a rapidly changing labor market. We have still some time, as it has been foreseen, for question and answers. So I'm looking to the auditorium who likes to address questions or make comments to what our colleagues have been presented. And I'm not sure that other colleagues are connected remotely. So let's start with colleagues who ask for the floor at the room. And I see Christian Bäumler, and then we make a list for other speakers. Christian, you have the floor.
Vielen Dank für das Wort. Vielen Dank für.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for all the contributions that we've been able to hear. I think it's really very important for worker participation in Germany as well, to ensure that legal changes can take place at national level and at EU level. The unions in Germany, Verdi and IG Metall to be precise, have been able to achieve significant success in the European Court of Justice in relation to co-determination in the SAP software company. And SAP, according to that ruling, is not able to push the unions out of the European Works Councils, and that's a huge success. We have to be absolutely clear about that, and to some extent it wasn't expected either. But on the other hand, it's also true to say that co-determination in Germany, as part of the transformation of a share company, was simply frozen. So the European company provides the possibilities of these rights being removed, and the Secretary of State already mentioned the foundation that's been set up in Germany, bringing together more than 100 European companies, employing more than 2,000 people. And according to German law, here there would need to be parity-based co-determination. But this legal form was made use of in order to ensure that in the case of 86 companies, notwithstanding more than 2,000 employees, that parity-based approach no longer exists, and there are only 21 European companies that still have this approach. And there are possibilities of doing something about this at national level. And here I wanted to address State Secretary Schmachtenberg when it comes to the legislation aimed at addressing cases where companies are shifted abroad, relocated abroad. But I would also entirely agree with previous speakers that when it comes to the European directive, we do need clarification to the effect that these types of legal forms cannot allow the unions to be pushed out or excluded.
I have a couple of colleagues who have asked for the floor. Next speaker would be José Antonio.
Muchas gracias, Reiner.
Thank you, Reiner. Well, I think that we're having a substantial debate this morning. It's a real discussion of substance because we're looking at things from the perspective of the trade unions, and actual exercising of democracy at the workplace involves a 21st century labour relations model, defining the rules of the game for post-industrial society based on democracy at the workplace. And that is far from where it should be at the moment. And I'd be interested to hear the speaker's opinions on a specific issue, which I think has a great deal to do with democracy at work, namely this. We need to work in order to live, but we can't die of work. That we can't afford. And this is the link between democracy at work and the fundamental right to safety, health and hygiene at the workplace. The European Social Agenda in Principle 10 talks about a safe working environment, and it refers to and the 2021-2025 European Commission strategy on safety and health at work. Well, I think that that's a substantial element when it comes to democracy at work in a safe and healthy environment. And we already have some ILO instruments which spell out the right to health and safety at work as a fundamental right, not of workers, but as human beings, quite simply. And so I'd be interested to hear your views on that question, health and safety at work. Thank you very much.
Very much to you, and remotely we have Franca who has asked for the floor. Franca, are you ready?
Bonjour, merci. Good morning. Thank you, Reiner. I'd like to wish good morning to my colleagues and to the speakers. I have a few remarks to make. We've just heard of some positive examples of worker participation, not only when it comes to negotiations, but also when it comes to corporate strategies. This is true of Germany. We know that it is a country that does have a system of co-determination. There are, however, a number of countries in Europe, especially in southern Europe, that have no idea of what worker participation is about when it comes to decision making. So I think we should bear in mind that there is a difference, because obviously if there is a European regulation, we know that there is a majority in favour of involving workers, as we heard from our German speaker. There is agreement more or less in Parliament, but what of the directive on this topic? And I think this is something we really need to address urgently, because otherwise we will have huge differences between companies that are prepared to involve workers in decision making as others which are of an Anglo-Saxon tradition but are present in Europe that tend to exclude workers from decision making processes, and therefore we could have different let's say speeds of take up. And then in terms of social responsibility, environmental responsibilities, companies are quite active. But if we look at supply chains, if we look at subcontractors or contractors, we know that the situation is quite different. We know that there is a French piece of legislation enacted in 2016 which applies to French companies, but is not enough. And I think that European Works Councils should always be on board, as Mr. Volker has just said, but we really need to encourage involvement and participation of all workers, even when it comes to contractors.
Thanks very much, Franca. Next speaker is Cinzia.
Grazie, Reiner.
Thank you, Reiner, and I would like to thank everybody for this extremely useful debate, which helps us better understand the situation in various countries. As you have said, as Franca has said quite rightly, the main problem is that of SMEs in Southern Europe, in Italy in particular. We know that 95% of companies have less than 15 employees. So, how are you going to promote participation given those circumstances? We know that in my country, in other Southern European countries, we know that over 90% of workers are covered by contracts because we have a system whereby collective contracts apply to workers. So on the one hand, yes, we do have contractual arrangements in place, but this is no substitute for workers' participation. So the real issue is how we can ensure that there is participation on the part of workers when we're talking about micro enterprises. We have, for instance, some experience with that in so-called industrial clusters. I'd like to know whether other countries have attempted to do something along those lines, because of course we're all aware of the advantages of participation in large companies, but as I said, not all countries are characterized by large companies. So coverage is, let's say, present. But on the other hand, in countries such as ours, there is an imbalance because that very small companies don't give workers the opportunity to participate, and therefore trade unions have a minor role in micro enterprises and in small-sized enterprises.
Thanks very much, Cynthia. Next speaker is Julia.
Yes, I also will continue in Italian. Intanto vorrei...
Well, first of all, allow me to thank all of the speakers for their extremely interesting presentations, which I found very insightful and thought-provoking. And like Cynthia did, I would like to say a few words about the fact that in Europe, for the most part, companies are mostly small or medium-sized. And I would also like to stress that there are differences when it comes to the, let's say, presence of collective bargaining and the role played by trade unions. And of course, the two go hand in hand. And there is a question that I would like to ask our speakers to address, if possible. Given the fact that there are differences between our various countries, and there are also differences with regard to industrial structures, surely we need to seek solutions at a European level. And I'm thinking in particular of the directives on worker consultation and information. We're talking about directives that date back to the 90s and to the 2000s. And we know that these directives have, in fact, somewhat changed the scenario when it comes to diversification. Directive 2002-14, for instance, established that member states had to ensure that there was information and consultation with, if necessary, the establishment of union representatives. And that is what the minimum wage directive is also taking into consideration, because it's not just about a minimum wage, but it's also about fostering collective bargaining. Consequently, I think that the common denominator could be that of the right to information and consultation. Participation is interesting, of course, but as we've heard, there are, some countries where this takes place in a positive way, but that isn't the rule elsewhere. So, of course, we have to promote participation, but I think that the most important point is ensuring that workers are adequately informed and consulted. And this is also the case when it comes to the European Works Councils and the 1994 directive. This shows, in fact, that this directive is still extremely relevant. In 2009, let us not forget, there was a recast, and as Mr. Telljohann said, this has meant that there are some, let's say, aspects that were not adequately covered, and therefore I think we need a real review process. So, best practices are all very well, but as some other speaker mentioned, we have to ensure that collective bargaining and the role of trade unions is enhanced, and that must go hand in hand with workers' participations. Otherwise, we're missing a fundamental link.
Thanks very much. I have 3 more speakers. In taking into consideration that we're running a little bit out of time, I would ask you that we finish the list, so in order also to give our colleagues who have given an input to give a short response to your remarks and to your questions. Next speaker is Christophe Lefebvre.
Thank you. I will speak in French.
I have 3 points I would like to make. I work for a European company that provides for the right of workers to participate and to participate in the board. However, in our company, and I don't think it's the exception, we are part of the, let's say, remuneration committee and sustainability committee, but we're not involved in the other committees. Other members of the boards are each members of 5 or 6 subcommittees. So, in other words, workers' representatives are limited in the type of involvement, and I think this is something we really need to work on. Second remark, and it has to do with gender equality. I've observed that in our company we have, let's say, gender equality in the board. They have a 2-year mandate, and then there's a turnover, whereas the men have a 4-year mandate, and there is a renewal, every 2 or 3. And that is an issue. Finally, another point I would like to make. And this refers to what our Italian colleague said. In France, over the last 2 years, we have a piece of legislation which makes it mandatory to have elections in small and medium-sized enterprises. But in the meantime, the French government has established a limit of 3 mandates. And once again, there are measures in place, but workers' opinions and workers' voices are in a way limited because there is a limit placed to the number of mandates. And we know that obviously that means that consultation will suffer. It all depends on goodwill. And then the French law establishes that a workers' representative who is elected to the board must resign from other bodies in the company. And this means that, for instance, we have a German colleague who was elected, but he had to resign from his role as president of the Betriebschaft. And so it is a rather strange rule because I think it really impinges on fundamental rights. That is all. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much to you, Christoph, also for being short and precise. I have 2 more speakers, Andrea and then followed by Lucy, and then we'll come back to the colleagues who have given the introduction.
Thanks. I will speak in Italian. Anch'io innanzitutto.
Well, first of all, allow me, as others before me have done, to thank the Spanish permanent representation for having focused on what we believe to be an extremely important topic. Now, when it comes to the debate at hand, integrating economic and social issues and ensuring that workers can participate in this context, on the one hand, we need to understand that the value of participation is not taken into due account. If you look at the European Commission's industrial policy strategy, when there is a discussion on enhancing Europe's industrial strategy, given the presence of multiple factors when productivity increases are involved, the Commission never mentions workers' participation, and this is not a minor point. It deserves to be stressed, and the same goes for the European social pillars. As was pointed out, there are many initiatives, but there's no mention of participation. There's only mention of information and consultation, but there's no mention of participation. This brings me to a question that I have for speakers. There's one issue that has not been examined yet, i.e., financial participation of workers. I would like to know what the speakers think about financial participation. We know, for instance, if we look at the ETUC data, that between 1998 and 2018, total dividend payments rose from between 20 to 60%, whereas the total of corporate investment dropped from 50 to 40%. So if major shareholders in multinational corporations, especially listed companies, are in most cases transnational entities, and of course speculation is often, let's say, their approach. We have in Italy 365 listed companies, and only 9 have a majority shareholders. So this means that there are many small shareholders, and this means that small shareholders, mostly workers, cannot in any way make a contribution. So my question is, how can we ensure that workers are more active when it comes to financial participation with forms of collective participation using different instruments? So I'd be very grateful if the speakers could address this matter. Thank you very much.
Thanks to you, Andrea. And now, Lucy, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Actually, extremely interesting morning session with the speakers and the debate until now. Actually, from my side, just a very simple and short question. We are here putting on the table arguments that we really, why we need and how beneficial is the participation, even co-determination in the German case, for the prosperity of the companies and the society as such. Actually, how to ensure this coming into real life, you know, which are the major obstacles on what we should work right now to bring it to the real life. We know that there's quite unique situation and opportunity now with the crisis going on, and we should actually definitely use it. So to all the speakers, how to do it and what is the most urgent for the moment. Thank you very much.
Thanks also very much to you, Lucy. I would go the other way around and to give our guests the floor, and starting with Sissel. If she is still online. Sissel, you have the floor. Probably you can focus on some of the questions and remarks which have been addressed.
Thank you. Yeah, it was several questions. And I think I want to start with a question about workload and the work-life balance and health and safety issues concerning the workers. In Norway, issues related to health and safety has been high up on the agenda, and especially in industries in a part of private service sector. And in 2010, we saw a sort of innovation in tripartite cooperation. They launched a sector program, which actually it was a result of the social partners. They recognized the need for closer and stronger cooperation with each other and with the authorities in order to handle dynamics of change, and especially in hard-pressed industries. In industries such as industrial cleaning, hotel and restaurants, and in transport, for mention some of them. And health and safety issues were very relevant issues, as well as tax evasion and the use of unregistered work. So it was also a sort of a way to combat social dumping. But these forms of programs has actually succeeded, at least in these hard-pressed industries. But of course, the question about psychosociological working environment issues are very high up on the agenda in Norway, and we have a lot of former employees who actually are outside the labor market because the speed is so high. So this is something that the social partners at the national level, at the sector level, but also at the company level are dealing with daily, I think. So that was one. I don't know if it was an answer, but I also want to mention one thing which I find important. In Norway, at least, we find that it is not enough to have a very comprehensive Working Environment Act, but it's actually the combination of a Working Environment Act and a collective agreement that makes any difference, because the two sort of framework seems to reinforce each other at the company level. So yeah, I think that's enough from me. Thanks.
Thanks very much to you, Sissel, especially for the last remark, to remind us that collective bargaining and workers' participation are enforcing each other. I think this should be, we should elaborate on this also in our opinion. Niklas, you have the floor.
Thank you so much for these super valuable observations and these important questions and concerns. They are very important, and I will sort of bring them with me in my future work. I have three brief points. First, as regards health and safety at work, a key issue, obviously. I think it's super important to not regard health and safety issues as bargaining chips in relation to the employer. And government intervention is key to form a level playing field for businesses. So that's sort of the Swedish take on it. Obviously, the health and safety workers have a particular flavor in societies where you have access to subsidized and very accessible healthcare, such as sort of the Nordic countries. So, and secondly, I want to address the concerns about SMEs. Obviously, the Swedish model works way worse in that sector. And the SMEs focus a lot on the regional level of trade unionism. So a sort of professionalized trade unionism on the regional level becomes key in unionizing and implementing trade union policy in that sector. Finally, the super important question about financial participation, which opens up a dimension that we haven't talked about today. In relation to that question, I want to mention that we have either not talked about collectives as sort of cooperatives as ways of conducting business, which could be another possible trade union venue. Sweden famously had an attempt to implement a financial participation scheme with the wage earners funds that were dismantled some 30 years ago, and so this means that idea is kind of dead in the Swedish discussion. So the Swedish system is based upon assumptions about a clear line of demarcation where trade unions go to the employer and demand things, and that's sort of instead of trying to implement financial participation schemes. And trade unions do not favor the idea of collectives or cooperatives as a ways of bettering work. Thank you.
Thanks to you, Niklas, and now it's your turn, Volker.
So I would like to reply to the question put by Franca on the role of EWCs in the context of due diligence. So I agree with Franca. So I think the implementation of a future EU directive on due diligence is not conceivable without the involvement of trade unions and workers' representatives, and in particular EWC members, because they often know much better what the working conditions on the ground actually look like. And so I think the European directive on mandatory due diligence and sustainability should build on social dialogue. So I think that is should be a very crucial demand. And that would mean that the involvement of EWCs throughout the whole process of identification, prevention, remedying and enforcing human rights risks and violations, and in the design, monitoring and enforcement of the envisaged due diligence tools and instruments is really key. If we want that this EU directive produces real results. With regard to the question on so I understood the question on financial participation also with regard, let's say, to the aspect of employee shareholder schemes and so participation rights linked to employee shareholder schemes. So I'm not sure whether I interpreted this question right. However, in any case, with regard to this aspect of employee shareholder schemes and participation rights, I think that there should be a clear priority on clearly regulated forms of institutionalized forms of participation at board level, independently of employee shareholder schemes.
Thanks very much, Volker. Unfortunately, Rolf Schmachtenberg had to leave the meeting earlier, so I couldn't ask him to give a short reply or response from his side. But I'm very keen that Fernández López would make a few remarks from your side. Fernando, you have the floor.
Gracias, Reiner.
Thank you, Reiner. Well, rather than comments as such, I'd just like to pick up on some of the points which I felt were particularly interesting, having listened to the debate, as we look ahead to the work that we will be doing in preparing our presidency as well. The first point that I thought was very relevant in this debate is the fact that it's important to... I'm afraid we've lost the microphone for the speaker. Yes, as I was saying, one of the first issues that I felt was very important as it came out of the debate was the need to move away from the formal aspects of participation, moving towards effectiveness and real meaningful participation. I think that's a point that really came across in a great many of the comments that we've heard. The fact that there's a lack of real, meaningful, effective participation And sometimes it's lacking on the formal front as well. Sometimes it's to do with different cultures, company cultures. But I think that that is an important strand that we need to work on. And there are some very important specific aspects that have been mentioned as well. Health and safety. Mention was made of SMEs and the implications for that type of business. Mention was made of financial participation and demographic changes as well. And this is all very much tied up with the specific situation of workers and the gender perspective as well. And something else that I think comes across in the debate is that clearly people see the need to put forward solutions at European level and to make progress on that. I think that's an important aspect. And I would end by saying that strengthening democracy at work at European level is a key aspect as well, so that we can help to improve social upward convergence within the European Union, which is one of the aims that will underpin all the work that we will be doing. Thank you very much.
Thanks also very much to you, Fernandez, and we are closing this session and moving on to the next session, and I guess that Marie-Carmen is in the room, and Marie-Carmen, please, could we change the place that you can take over, please?
Sí, bueno, pues.
Right. I'm going to speak Spanish. Okay. Well, so let's now move on to our second panel with a slight delay as compared to our schedule, but hopefully we'll be able to make up on lost time so that we finish on time. We're going to be talking here about decent work and the need to codify democracy at work in a legal manner based on the example of due diligence. Now, the authorities are clearly insufficient. They can't guarantee this themselves, and so it's important that not only do we lay down a legal framework, but we also need to shape policy and socially responsible public procurement as well as a tool in order to combat forced labour and child labour as well. So with that in mind, eradication of forced labour is one of the demands, one of the fundamental demands that our group has been making. And the December plenary adopted the opinion on decent work. And I was honoured to be rapporteur on that opinion. And in it, we call for European Union support to a binding UN treaty on decent work and human rights, and also the establishment of an ILO convention on the decent work throughout the supply chain. And in the opinion, we also call for a community legal framework which is effective, covering mandatory due diligence in company boards, which could be invoked at all levels, all traditional levels within the European Union, based on social dialogue with the social partners and based on a multi-stakeholder approach. And as rapporteur, I would say that I think it's important that these issues were including in the opinion, but not without difficulties in view of the opposition of the employers group. As I believe we are all aware in this group, we are abundantly aware of that. Now, this opinion and also the debate that we've been having here today is very opportune. It's very timely at the moment, given the current picture, because given the various crises, the concurrent crises, we don't have the means of guaranteeing people decent work. And coming out of the former fiscal crisis, now seeing austerity measures and the like, well, this is a very harsh crisis, and it's hitting a great many European countries. And in order to ensure that more people have proper standards at work, that is a vital prerequisite in order to ensure their growth. And with that in mind, the Commission has already set in motion an initiative aimed at enforcing a real ban on products entering the labour market which were manufactured by means of forced labour, including child labour. Nonetheless, even though it is true to say that in the opinion we welcome the Commission's initiative to wish to play a lead role in this area, in the opinion we do point out significant shortcomings. And we think that this should be a good source of information for the ensuing debate. And the scope of the directive doesn't include everything that was included in the original Parliament proposal, and we feel that all companies need to play a role in combating forced labour. Apart from that, the method used in order to define the rights which are protected excludes climate change and also vulnerable groups, among others. Furthermore, defining corporate responsibility is rather vague and ambiguous and lacking legal rigour in the way it's defined. And there are also possibilities of companies shirking their responsibilities, and mere formal commitments alone will not be enough if there is no real obligation for compliance. And lastly, the most important point is that it excludes trade union organisations from the process. Trade union representations and European Works Councils do not have a guaranteed appropriate level of participation throughout the supply chain. And this last point is really important, and indeed it's fundamental as far as we're concerned, and it's vital if we are to combat forced labour. So we need national networks with trade union participation for the governance of due diligence in order to ensure that due diligence, which is what we've been calling for some time now in this group, is one of our longest standing demands, if that is really to be a tool, an instrument to help to achieve decent work. So in this debate, we have some guests with us today taking part in the session. On my right, we have Isabelle Schömann, who is very well known to all of us here. She's very close to our group, of course. And I would introduce her by saying that she was elected in 2019 at the 14th ETUC Congress, determining ETUC policy on worker participation and the industrial policy, labour law, the internal market and legislation, and digitalisation, standardisation, public services, corporate company law, among other topics, which are of great interest to us. And she also worked as a principal advisor to the European Commission Standardization Committee and as a principal researcher at the European Trade Union Institute. So welcome, Isabelle, and thank you very much for being with us today. Thank you for accepting our invitation. So I'd like to start by putting the first question to you. We know that SMEs are included by means of the obligations in the supply chain, because as I just said, in the draft it doesn't specify that the scope covers SMEs, but we also know that SMEs can be inclined to circumvent their responsibilities in order to avoid incurring costs, as they claim, or to avoid administrative burden, because they say that those obligations are beyond their control, even though, in our opinion, we did try to offset that by providing an impact assessment, specifically looking at SMEs and these new obligations, in order to avoid those types of arguments being adduced against the application of these rules to them. Now, what do you feel the impact will be of the new directive on due diligence and corporate sustainability in the light of the Commission's and the Council's intention to exclude from the scope SMEs as compared to the original European Parliament's intentions? So, thank you very much indeed, and you have the floor.
Thank you so much for your invitation, and of course, as you mentioned, for this very timely meeting today, in particular because if you look at the state of play and the latest development, in particular the draft opinion of the Employment Committee and Social Affairs of the European Parliament exactly on this point, we are very much struck to see that we are nowhere. So not only the Commission has on purpose not mentioned us in terms of actors, but simply in terms of stakeholders to which there is a possibility to get information from. So we are kind of there if relevant. So if the corporations want to get some information, but not as actor of, not as constituencies of business, what workers are and trade unions and workers' representatives are in terms of representing the interest of workers. So, and if you look at the opinion of the draft opinion of the Employment Committee so far, it's exactly the same. The recital says that the Employment Committee would like to push, and I just want to quote, to push strongly for the integration of workers' representative and social partner. But that's it. That's the only sentence, and that's in the recitals. So we have no real anchor in this draft proposal, nor coming from the Employment Committee. And I think this is a very worrying development we have to take on board. So, all the more important that we request and we insist on having a legally binding directive on, and I would like to stress the previous title, the very telling title, which is Mandatory Human Rights Due Diligence and Responsible Business Conduct, because if you speak now about sustainability, you can include everything. And of course we want to include a lot, human rights and the environment. But what we see is that in terms of the environment, we have even a target, which is mentioned in the draft proposal of the Commission. When it comes to workers' representations, when it comes to workers' involvement, nothing. So here, again, exactly like we've seen for the taxonomy discussions, The social does not count. What counts is the environment, because it's a lot of, you know, it's in the forefront of the discussions for a moment. It's what business want to position themselves, and we know why. It's in particular because a lot of support, state aid, among other, are involved, but workers' representations and workers' interest is not mentioned as it should be, let alone the fact that we all have recognized and we have put evidence coming from the European Economic and Social Committee, coming from the national research institutes, coming even from the ETY, the European Research Institute, on the added value for businesses and for workers on a good social dialogue in listed companies throughout Europe. Even if we put as much evidence as we want on the table, it's not there. So, of course, here there is a strong push and a strong mobilization to still be done. So, from the ETUC, an appeal to you to strengthen at your respective level the need for including in this draft legislation the role of workers' representatives and trade unions in preventing any violation of human rights at the workplace. And here we speak about violation of workers' rights. The equations, workers and trade unions' rights are human rights, should be done here and concretely. And why do we need to have a legislative directive and a legally binding obligations to involve us, not just when business want and about what business want? It's because we are legitimate actors. We have prerogative to be informed and consulted. We have prerogative to bargain collectively on workers' rights, to protect them at the workplace, independently whether this workplace is in the supply chain or not, independently or whether this workplace is in or outside the European Union, as long as, you know, those businesses are covered by the directive. And this is exactly your point, Marie-Carmen, where we have to look at the risk of exemptions of certain businesses. And of course, we understand that there is what the European Commission called the Things Small First, coming from the better regulation agenda, so the SME test when it comes to assessing impact assessment, which underpinned, of course, a legal proposal. And of course, we understand that there is a proportionate avenue so that SMEs are helped to comply, but that's not an exemption. And of course, what we see here is that, and this is a real issue, I think, for all Europe, is that when we see the narrative around due diligence, when we see the narrative on the obligations to report, being from big businesses up to small businesses, on exactly violation or potential violation of risk of violation of human rights, what it is identified as, it's a cost, it's a burden. And as long as we don't change this narrative, we won't change the behavior of businesses to look at exactly mandatory human rights due diligence as a burden, as a cost. And we have to trigger this shift towards workers is an investment. Social dialogue and workers' participation is an investment, is an asset for business. And this is exactly the reasons why we need to have a legally binding obligation for business to comply with EU legislations on workers' information, consultation, participation, including European Works Council, which is, of course, not mentioned yet. Thank you.
Gracias, Isabelle.
Thank you, Isabelle. Yes, I entirely agree with the approach that you're advocating, and that we need to try to ensure that companies change their mindset in claiming that they need to comply with human rights shouldn't be seen as a burden, but it should be seen as something that should happen anyway, and it should give rise to positive synergies and greater productivity for companies as well. So I'd like to move on to my next guest now, Lieve Verboven. She's the director of the ILO office to the EU and Benelux countries. She was previously a federal labour mediator as part of the Belgian Federal Public Service section on employment and social dialogue, and prior to that she was a labour relations officer at the Health Sciences Association of Alberta. She was also a social dialogue expert of the ILO programme in Francophone Africa. So thank you very much indeed. And the first question in the debate is this. I'd like to say, how do you feel that the directive proposed can be aligned with the international standards promoted in the field of due diligence? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Maria Carmen, and good morning to all of you. It's an honor to be here again physically after quite some time, and happy to take the floor on this very concrete question, Maria Carmen. So what does the ILO see through our lens of our own legal framework, let's say? How do we look at the proposed directive, and how can it be better aligned with international standards promoting due diligence? First, a few pluses, and then concretely, how can it be better aligned? So first, the good news is that not later than last week, at the ILO governing body, and the governing body is where workers' organizations and employers' organizations, together with the governments, decide upon strategic agenda items of the ILO. Last week, they gave a go-ahead to the ILO to develop a strategy on decent work in global supply chains. And that's important. It's further giving green light to the ILO to develop this, and to be in the lead as well at the international level, to have a comprehensive strategy on achieving decent work in global supply chains. And if we look at what has been agreed internationally there, then certainly what employers and workers and governments say is that mandatory due diligence can play an important role within a smart mix of measures. And because what we see is many existing domestic laws, and also this proposal, which is at the regional level, will have different scopes, different measures, etc. So at least an EU-wide approach goes in the good direction, and when it's aligned with what is internationally agreed, it can really play an important role. And when we talk about that international alignment, there are three texts that we refer to. It's the ILO M&E Declaration of principles concerning multinational enterprises and social policy. It's the UN Guiding Principles concern business and human rights, and then the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. So those are the three instruments. And with these other two entities, with the OECD and OHCHR, ILO has, when the Commission's proposal came out, welcomed the directive. We have stressed that it needs to be aligned. And for a few things that are important then for the ILO is first and foremost the fact that some concepts are new and are not reflected in one of these three instruments that I referred to. The first one is an established business relationship. It's a new concept, and it's not really, let's say, helpful to really reach the objective of due diligence if the aim of the objective is to expand respect for human rights in all business operations. So that's the first note. The concept in itself is not used in those other 3 instruments that are internationally agreed. And I would just recommend you to go to the ILO declaration. Paragraph 10D says that enterprises, including multinational enterprises, should carry out due diligence to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for how they address their actual and potential adverse impacts that relate to internationally agreed human rights. So from that paragraph only, we conclude it's all enterprises that are expected to carry out due diligence, whether or not there is a legal obligations for them to do so. So trying to make a distinction in there is not is not really aligning it with the international framework. The other concept now that is missing in the proposed directive, which is present in the international instruments, is the referral to meaningful consultation. Meaningful consultation with workers and their representatives. That is key for any due diligence process. In ILO wording, workers are rights holders, not only stakeholders. And yeah, the last thing I would like to say to fully align the proposal is that in the last conference of the International Labour Organization in July, the Occupational Health and Safety Conventions 155 and 187 have been now recognized as being fundamental. So fundamental rights and principles are now 5 categories, not just child labor, forced labor, freedom of association and collective bargaining, and the non-discrimination category, but also there is now the fundamental right for a safe and healthy environment. So there in our ILO M&E declaration, all ILO conventions are important, but the fundamental ones are clearly prioritized as well. So, and somehow that has to be reflected in the proposed directive. Maybe I'll stop there, Maria Carmen.
Muchas gracias, Lieve.
Thank you very much, Lieve. That was very interesting. And you touched on some points that we took into account in drawing up our opinion, in particular, the new consensus, as you rightly called it, in established trade relations, commercial relations, in that this should be a significant part of all the rules laid down in the forthcoming directive. But that it's all a bit vague, as we say in our opinion. It's not really legally rigorous, and that it's important that this is addressed in the future text in order to ensure that there is more rigor when we come to require that companies comply with these obligations. Thank you very much indeed. So now to come back to Isabelle, the first speaker as well, I have a very specific question for you. When it comes to the extent to which the current non-binding legal framework is to be replaced overall by a genuinely binding treaty on a global basis, which we were calling for in the opinion, very strongly, if I can put it like that, because this was one of the most controversial issues and most hotly debated issues in Group 1 here in the committee. What is your view in this regard? And what are the real expectations that you have that this will be will be turned into reality, will become a reality? Because that is absolutely vital. It wouldn't be possible to have a directive really without it being binding. You have the floor. Thank you very much.
Yeah, this is exactly the point of contention. It's of course We know that we will have a directive. Now, when, this is the questions. We put all our efforts to have it within this legislature period, which is, of course, ending May 2024. So we have still some time to go, but we understand that for the European Parliament, likewise for the Council, it's a bit difficult to position itself. We understood that the European Parliament had to fight a bit who is responsible, who has competences. So now that it has been settled, we know that the European Parliament will be ready by sometimes, which is May 2023, which is leave us for the time for trilogue, a bit short indeed. But the idea is that we have to have, at the end of the day, a directive in this legislature. Otherwise, it will be postponed, and of course, the more it is postponed, the longer we will have to wait, and the more the discussions might end up to nothing. But of course, to have a directive which would be empty will not work. And this is exactly what we have seen, the development of the changes of spirit of the initiative from the beginning, where it was a directive to avoid any situations back in time like the Rana Plaza, who businesses had no obligations, so no liability to come up for the very adverse impact of their businesses on workers and their communities and the environment. But if we look at the Rana Plaza and the numbers of deaths at the workplace because of the externalization of the cost of labor, amongst other things, to the utmost, which is, of course, the willingness not to be liable for those costs, so, to put the burden on others, being subcontractors or being individuals at the end of the day. And, of course, not complying with any ILO conventions, not even asking to comply with the fundamental rights of the European Union when it comes to do business and of course, to have access to support, for example, in the European Union in terms of crisis more than in other situations, of course. So here, of course, the spirit was to provide support for victims. And the victims, clearly here, are not the business. The victims are the workers. Now, what you see in the proposal of the directive is a reversal of this spirit. What we see is that when it comes to victims, it's at the very end to claim the possibility to go to court with the support, of course, of trade unions. At that point, we come in play. But before that, not. But clearly here, when it comes to the reversal of the burden of proof, for example, for the victims to have access to justice, nothing. So even that is not even respected. And I would like to recall that the obligations of European institutions, according to the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European, Article 47, is to facilitate access to justice for the victims. So even there, we are not where we should be. So that of course, what has changed. And of course, what has not changed in comparison to the current situations is that we are still in a situation whereby business can do what they want, when they want, and with whom they want. In terms of saying, I do comply or not with human rights, and then which one, so I choose, and with whom, workers' representative, but stakeholders, yeah, of course we could. And then everyone is at once, targeted as addresses for, I can get information from you, as I mentioned in the beginning. But whether I involve you, whether I consult with you meaningfully, nothing. So here we have seen, and it was also recognized quite clearly from the rapporteur of the European Parliament report, Lara Wolters, that there is a shift, a change really in the spirit of what we should have. And clearly here, what we see throughout the whole proposal of the Commission is a red carpet for business to be incentivized, not even to be obliged, to be incentivized to respect and to comply with the very bare minimum of human rights. And it was mentioned that for us it's the bare minimum to respect indeed the core ILO convention. So what we need to see is a clear move. No, the baseline is very low. You understand the baseline is a copy-paste of the corporate social responsibility that we have for the moment. Even the wording of code of conduct is there. We don't need to word a code of conduct anymore. This is, you know, the business being judge and party at the same time in deciding with whom, on what, and when to do compliance. And this is a shift that we have to operate, that business are not the only one to decide whether or not and with whom they want to comply about human rights, including the environment, and not respecting, and this is clearly here something that is not acceptable coming from the European Commission, that even the reference to information and consultation of workers' representative is mentioned. And of course the issue of strengthening the way workers' representative can prevent violation, which is exactly what we are. You know, it's not when your hand has been cut or Rana Plaza, you died because the building collapsed, that, you know, we can do a lot. We can do, of course, in terms of remedies, but that's too late. And clearly here, the idea of prevention is exactly where we are, and because we are the one who knows how the workplace functions. So here we have to have this change in the spirit again, back to what it should be. And clearly here, it will also, if we manage that, it will also impact the way we can monitor the implementation, but also the way we can enforce effective rights. And here again, if we are not actors, recognized as actors, and we have this prerogative at the European level, if it is not recognized, then it will be very difficult to be able to move forward. And just one point, because it's, I understand that the discussion is also currently moving towards something which is very complicated, and it's about due diligence plan and strategy, and also the reporting obligations. And we know that there is a change in the legislation at the European level from the non-financial reporting to the corporate sustainability reporting directive, whereby the expert group should deliver very soon recommendations to the Commission, because the Commission has delegated its responsibility to set those standards to an expert group. That here, of course, the wording counts, but the baseline, or the basis on which this expert group base itself, and despite a large work and a very constant work from the ETUC, is not the ILO Convention. I had to fight last week whether it's the ILO Convention who counts in terms of having a sound recommendations to the Commission, or the standards put by the Global Reporting Initiative, or standard setters. Yeah, exactly, but that's where we are. So, you know, for me, it's not understandable that even those core fundamental conventions are not the baseline for everyone out there. And we know why. Again, back to business. Auditing on standards is business. And this is where those big enterprises, those big auditing enterprises would like to sell to business how best they can do diligence, ticking the box and saying, I've done that on child labor, I've done that on, let's say, forced labor, and I'm safe. I have no liability because I did my tick the box. And I think we have to be clear about these dimensions. So the complication of the narrative is an obstacle we have to fight, but we should not stop there. And clearly here we have to distinguish between the reporting and the obligations of having a strategy on due diligence.
Gracias, Isabelle. Bueno, la respuesta creo que...
Thank you very much indeed. Yes, I think that was a very clear response. Yes, we do need binding principles, that's quite true. But the situation is complicated at the moment in terms of whether this is likely to become reality in the near future. Okay, let's move on to the second question for Lieve, coming back to you. Clearly, due diligence can only be effective if it is guaranteed, as we said earlier, that there is meaningful consultation of workers and their representatives. Now, perhaps you could expand a little on that and give us a bit more detailed information on this issue, which is very interesting for us. Thank you very much.
Yes, so meaningful consultation, what would it mean and what is set in international framework? So the ILO declaration itself says that the process of due diligence should involve meaningful consultation with potentially affected groups and other relevant stakeholders, including workers' organizations. And earlier, Isabelle, you said clearly that you don't like the if relevant consultation. And indeed, the if relevant does not align with meaningful consultation. The if relevant in the text is a qualifier, confusing in a way things, making it optional, making it not as an essential part of the due diligence process that there is meaningful consultations. And as I told earlier, workers are not just stakeholders, but also rights holders. Now, so the reference there to consultation with workers' representatives organization being essential to the due diligence process, that's important, but how can we now define what is that meaningful consultation? And if we want to dig that out a little bit, I have two ways to tackle it, saying what and when. This is important. On the what is meaningful consultation, there is the OECD Investment Committee that last year, 2021, clarified the concept. What is in relation to meaningful consultations with trade unions in due diligence processes. And it indicates three elements. First, meaningful stakeholder engagement is a key feature of due diligence process. Secondly, companies should prioritize meaningful engagement with bona fide trade unions where these exist when conducting due diligence related to risks to employment and the human rights of workers. And three, they have established that industry-led or multi-stakeholder due diligence processes through which companies conduct due diligence should be credible and include engagement with workers' representatives. So that's on the clarifying of the concept that has been done by the OECD Investment Committee in 2021, and where also ILO gave input. Then on the when this meaningful consultation should be conducted in a due diligence process, the OECD due diligence guidance says it's at all steps of the due diligence process. So going from the identification of actual and potential adverse impact in the context of the activities of the company. Secondly, in engagement in an assessment of business relationships with respect to real or potential adverse impacts. Thirdly, in devising prevention and mitigations responses to risks of adverse impacts. Fourth, identifying forms of remedies for adverse impacts. And lastly, also tracking and communicating on how actual or potential identified human rights impacts in the context of the activities are being addressed. So on all these steps is in these guidelines said that there should be meaningful stakeholder engagement. Yeah, I think I elaborated quite well that questions with giving concrete elements that could be useful for further working on your documents. Maria Carmen, over to you.
Pues muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Lieve. Well, yes. Yes, that was a detailed reply. But as you said when you took the floor for the first time, not all the paragraphs in the text of the directive actually set out all the detail regarding the various issues. And if that was the case, it would be a lot clearer for people who have to interpret the directive. Okay, let's move back to the first speaker, Isabelle, now. And another question. I'll step up the pace a bit now because we don't have much time left. So far, in the Commission's draft proposal, union presence is provided for in a very watered-down, very weak manner, as I said initially, and representatives of trade unions and workers' rights are not really acknowledged in the provisions of the proposal. They're only in the annex to the directive. And as we heard here, reference is made to consultation of the trade unions using a generic formula, but it doesn't talk specifically about workers' representatives, but stakeholders, and we don't find that acceptable either, as you'll be aware. And the European Parliament, in its own initiative opinion, called for a guarantee of participation of trade unions representing workers at national trade union and global level as part of the implementation of the due diligence strategy. And as you'll also be aware, the Commission included participation by trade unions in the first draft, but subsequently they backtracked on that. Now, how can we interpret this? I think we can all basically form an idea of what's going on here, but I think it would be helpful to hear what you think about this, because clearly we can't have due diligence, presumably on a daily basis, which serves a useful purpose, which is what we want. We can't have it unless there is an appropriate level of representation right the way through the chain. So how can trade unions and workers' representatives be ensured a strong and proactive participation throughout the whole of the identification, prevention, repair and remediation of risk process, and also when it comes to the design, monitoring and implementation of the due diligence tools which are provided for? So, Isabelle, over to you. You have the floor. Thank you.
I think the difficult exercise would be exactly to have the balance between our role recognized in this directive, but not too detailed, so that we have still the leeway and the possibility to adapt to the sectors, to the situations in which we are, given that, of course, we want to look into the supply chain and not stop at the first tiers, and, of course, to join forces inside the European Union and outside the European Union with our international colleagues. So, of course, this is this very important balance that we do not want to be too detailed, and, of course, this is where the discussions and the counterparts want to lead us, you know, and well, you want to have information consultation, but where there is no workers' representative, how do we do that? You know, kind of, and those obligations from the ILO, that's of course not for us businesses, that's for the member states. So we have all these discussions around the table just to avoid the discussions that of course we just need, and it was from the very outset the request we had to the Commission. We just need to have the reference to the existing rights of workers' representatives on information and consultations. And of course, to mention that the way forward is collective bargaining if we want to change the situations together for the better. And I think this is the only two demands we have, and it's not mission impossible, of course not. We know that from the minimum wage directive. The strengthening of collective bargaining is there. So, you know, it's not something that we would create new rights or whether we want to add more obligations to businesses. That's not the case, not at all. But of course, we understand that here the late addition of lead from the Commission has not helped. And of course, the change in the spirit of the proposal has been to help businesses to comply. What we have to manage is that with this reference to workers' representative and the right of information consultation, and of course the promotion of collective bargaining, which is, of course, what should be, that we will help to get out of a unilateral way. If business want to look at human rights, business want or do not want to respect human rights, is stopped. And I see exactly here that business, of course, do not like that, because not only will they have to discuss with us and to open these informations and what is happening outside, you know, I would say the bubble of the European Union, where we see that, of course, we have regulation when it comes to labor cost, and you can't employ someone on any basis, but you can do that outside the European Union, and of course, the cheaper the better. But business cannot do business on that basis. And if business can organize the quality control of any product produced outside the European Union, they can control how this product has been manufactured. And it should be part of the quality control. And if they notice that, or if they have identified that this product is based on child labor or is based on abuse of working time or working condition, then they have to stop businesses to do business with those subcontractors, or they have to even adapt their manufacturers. Thank you.
Bueno, pues como vamos.
Right, thank you. Yes, well, since time is running a bit short, as it always does with the final session, I think we'll now take a round of comments to see whether anybody wishes to take the floor, whether anyone has any questions. Dimitro?
Gracias, señora presidenta. Thank you very much. What to say? We speak about principles, about values that has to be respected by the employers, organization, by the governments. But finally, if we see and we make an assessment of what is happening in our own countries, we see that even the legislation is not respected when we are talking about labor rights. In Romania, we have a package of at least 5 legislative works which are not respected, and meanwhile, our governments are bringing 100,000 people, non-EU migrants from Nepal, Cambodia, and other countries. So it's important, the political leverage in this discussion, and if the politicians are not taking this into account, we are just going there, and we ask for patience from our members, but an Arab proverb says that the patient is the power of the weak. So we are in this situation now. We are the weak side, and nobody is taking our part and our side in this huge battle which is taking place in Europe. So I don't know exactly what we have to do, but we are in a big impasse because the European Commission, it's not sanctioning those governments which are not respecting their own laws, which are results of the political debates in the parliament. But they are respecting the laws on debts, the laws on the financial contract with the respective countries. Even in Belgium, I understood that they are not respecting the indexation law. I don't know if something changed, but if we don't respect the law which are related with the social life, what will happen with the European Union? Thank you.
Thomas?
Ja, zunächst möchte ich mich mal recht.
Well, I'd like to start by thanking you very much indeed for giving us a chance to raise this topic and to have it on our agenda on an ongoing basis. Because I think we've already made quite a lot of progress, starting from the first conference that we had. And I think we've heard a very good portrayal of just where the difficulties lie. Just to repeat, these aren't merely questions of detail, these are fundamental issues. And we've also heard that the spirit of this legislation, this initiative has changed, and the question is when and where did that change take place? My impression was that in the Parliament, in the resolution, and the rapporteur, Lara Wolters, indicated that the spirit as being pretty much along the right lines, although there were some further improvements. But in the Commission, I'm not sure whether quite simply, well, how can I put it, whether it's simply the prevailing view in the Commission, because we don't just have the EU initiative, we also have the Geneva initiative of the Human Rights Council, where the Commission isn't doing anything at all, isn't taking a stance at all, isn't even participating officially in the discussions and the negotiations on that issue there in Geneva. So I think things have already reached a fairly advanced stage. And I think we've seen how things have been watered down in an earlier directive, and just how effective lobbying was, and the same goes for us in the committee. So I really would like to thank Mari once again for giving us an opportunity to defend ourselves against some of the points raised by the employer's side when we discussed your opinion. But I think this serves to illustrate what the prevailing view is on the employer's side, unfortunately, I would say. So how likely is it, do you think, that these fundamental issues, the clear participation by trade unions and works councils in the whole supply chain, questions of liability, responsibility, how can we ensure that these ideas, which were the very basis, the starting point for this initiative a few years ago, how can we ensure that these are brought in to the process? And in Austria, I must say, where I'm doing a lot of work on this issue, I see that unfortunately our Ministry of Justice, which is taking the lead on this issue, isn't really that keen to take up the position that the unions are calling for, but rather they keep on invoking the current proposal for a directive and say that that is what they are representing in their views. And unfortunately, I get the impression that that's just the way things are going at the moment. So how likely do you think it is that we can really do something to reverse this process so that we don't just have a sort of greenwashing process when it comes to workers' rights and indeed human rights? Thank you. The Chair. Cinzia, very briefly, please.
Yes, I just wanted to say that, as far as I can see, the problem is that there are way too many voluntary instruments. We have the ILO's MNE tripartite declaration, the OECD guideline on multinational corporations, the business and human rights document. So we are talking about moral suasion here. There are ad hoc working groups, ad hoc committees, but when it comes to due diligence and the proposal for a directive on due diligence, we are not involved, we're not consulted, nobody's invited us to discuss this. Therefore, the risk is that we will be wasting a lot of effort here. All 27 European member states have ratified the 8 fundamental conventions and have transposed them into national legislation. Consequently, if there is violation in the transposition, we have the Committee of Experts of the ILO that can intervene. So we can't accuse, governments and tell them that, there's a potential misinterpretation or whatever. There can be no doubt as to what the whole meaning of this, i.e. how can member states comply with the 8 fundamental conventions plus regulations on safety and health. The thing is that these conventions have been ratified, so there can be no question that they have been interpreted and they have been enshrined in national legislation. So that should be our focus. Perhaps we should be less prepared to discuss voluntary instruments, because otherwise we're going to get bogged down on the UN business and human rights instrument, whereas in fact European companies must abide by more stringent criteria. Sorry if I got carried away there.
Gracias, Cinzia.
Thank you, Cinzia. Florian?
Thank you. I will be very brief because I think it's a very interesting discussion what we have here. So my concrete questions to the panelists are the next ones. How do you see the relation between poverty in some member states and the acceptance of products which are being produced under I don't know, forced labor, for example. Because it's a critical issue. Some consumers are accepting this product because they are poor and they are not in a position to choose what they are buying. And the next one is linked to the, I will give an example more concretely. Look at the textile industry. You know, we have enough standards, enough code of conduct, and those are not enough. You know, after 10 years or 20 years, we have the same problems in the industry as we had in the 1990s, for example. So things are becoming worse. And my concrete questions to you, the concrete question, sorry, is what instrument do you think that are appropriate to ensure that the workers' rights are being respected? Because if you are looking at the textile industry, you know, the implication of brands and enough standards but also of code of conduct, also involvement of workers in some member states, it's not enough. We need to discuss about building capacity, consolidation of the public institution, but also to discuss about control and monitoring, and why not to have a sort of social conditionalities when we are discussing about state aids and public investments. Thank you so much.
Gracias, Florian. Pasamos a un turno ahora de...
Thank you. So now we'll hear a round of replies from our speakers, starting with Lieve. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I know we have a few minutes left, so I will concentrate on your direct question, Mr. Martin. On the relation between poverty and products on forced labor, we recently published our estimates, global estimates on forced labor, and what we see in the world globally, forced labor is everywhere, also in high-income countries, also in the European region. There is a prevalence everywhere, and it's on the rise everywhere in the private sector. It's driven, the rise of it is driven by the private sector. So the question was also with the example you gave on, do poor people have a choice in buying a product made of forced labor? Yeah, I would say, especially now with the crisis, people will go for the lower price product. And yes, there is a correlation there, I guess. And a lower priced product, it can have many reasons why it is lower priced. So maybe, yeah, I can say that on your question. I don't go into the proposed regulation on the forced labor products ban because our panel is more about the due diligence directive. And on that, you gave some interesting views on what else should be done, because so far things to advance respect of workers' rights, the fundamental ILO conventions, have not been enough, not just outside the EU, but also within the EU. And what else could be done? So, as I said earlier, the directive in itself, a mandatory due diligence, can be part of a smart mix, but also public procurement regulation and due diligence there is another instrument. Building capacity, like you said. Working with the partner countries, the developing countries where there is huge informality, to help them formalize their economy. That's another way of tackling root causes of deficits in decent work, and then helping companies to do better work and working with and assuring decent work all along the supply chains. So as well as in partner countries, pushing for collective bargaining and freedom of associations and building capacities of employers and workers' organizations. And lastly, also what you said on labor administrations, national legislations which has ratified and implemented ILO conventions, should be monitored, and capacity has to be built within labor administrations to be able to do so. So it's working on different levels that will help advance workers' rights.
Okay. Gracias, Lieve.
Thank you, Lieve. So let's now turn to Isabelle. Go ahead.
Thank you. A legally binding instrument will give us clearly a strong leverage, much more than what we have. For the moment, we have nothing really in the hands at the European level. That's where I stay for the moment because it's the target we have. We have a proposal. This proposal should deliver, and it should deliver in particular when it comes to workers' rights because it's where we have a role to play. But clearly, if we have nothing, then we will stay in the voluntary/unilateral kind of doing things by business, and this will not deliver. So that's the first point. Second, what should we do now? And you mentioned rightly the current situation is not that good for us. But clearly, it's not any reasons to give up. On the contrary, we have very much empowered the affiliate of the TUC to table amendments that we have jointly worked on and agreed upon. So we have transparently circulated those amendments. We are targeted on a daily basis, the European Parliament and the Council, where, of course, relevant, and via our colleagues at the national level, to make sure that we are getting in a way or the others, coming from the front door or the back door, in exactly the decisions that are taking for the moment, which is currently at the European Parliament level, the different committees, and here, as I mentioned, some of them with deadline for amendments will be in November. So we are working on them quite hardly, and we will have the votes sometimes beginning of next year, which will of course be very important where we further mobilize. I think the issue of enforcement is of course, you can only have enforcement if you have a legally binding obligations, and this is exactly what we need to have. And of course, this is what also we need to build. It won't come from itself. It's not given for granted that we will be able to, to get what we want. But clearly here, we want to have a reference to the European legislations to make the difference at the European level, because it's a European directive. Exactly like the GDPR. The GDPR is a European regulations that has impact outside, exactly like the whistleblower directive. So we have already experienced that it works. And this is exactly in that context that we are, in this spirit that we are working. And of course, workers' participation is the point I wanted to stress today, because it's clearly missing. But the other point is, of course, the liability point. And what we have to make sure is that the liability that should come into this directive will not undermine existing joint and several liabilities of businesses that already exist in European legislations when it comes to the mineral conflict regulation or when it comes to the timber regulation. And of course, the sanctions exist already. So if, for example, Florin, you have a situation by which wood or furniture based on the wood production outside the European Union is based on forced labor. It cannot enter the labor market, the internal labor market here, sorry. Because exactly it's not in compliance with the rules that are already existing in this timber regulation. So the sectoral dimension is key, and this is also one of the dimensions that business want to unlock. Of course, what they want to have is a kind of general liability, and if they just tick the box, I've done that and it's enough, I am not liable for the rest. And this is exactly what we are also working on, so that we have here two sets of a liability that not diminish each other. That's another point which is key. One element which is of course based on the impact that we need to have in terms of reinforcing public authority. This is part of the directive. It's something new. This is something which is implemented currently in Germany, and I think it's test case, and we will have to see that. But clearly, the Human Rights Due Diligence Directive will not make it all. And we need, as it was mentioned, to work on state aids, to work on public procurement. We need to work on trade agreement, because it's exactly where business is done. There are other dimensions, but competition policy is one of the very important issues we have to tackle.
Pues nada más.
Okay, well, all that remains for me is to thank our guests very much indeed for taking part in this session. Thank you, Isabelle. Thank you, Lieve. Well, I think it's clear that a lot of important work has been done and that our positions are closer together, but obviously we must continue to fight to ensure that forced labour is eradicated and that workers' rights are reality. I'll just hand the floor now very briefly to Oliver, who will close the meeting.
Thank you very much, Carmen, and thank you very much to all our guests and speakers. My only task is to close this session, and I think this is my personal view that the input was very valuable and interesting in the morning, and both in the morning, but in both sessions, because I think what we could see is that this debate was the logical extension of our initiatives that we started, of course also the ETUC, but we started it in the EESC. The question of a stronger workers' voice, mandatory involvement of workers. We have this in several opinions, so we are definitely pushing for this, but on the other hand, also pushing for a decent work agenda worldwide. I remind ourselves that we had a debate during the trio presidency with the labor ministers, Ana Mendes Godinho, but also with the Slovenian and German colleagues. They were fully supporting this project. And I think therefore it's totally linked, the question of democracy at work as part of participatory democracy, and the question of binding human rights, legally binding provisions. And therefore I'm happy that we are supporting this and that we received also so much support from ILO and from other speakers today. And the last remark when it comes to workers' involvement and democracy at work, my conclusion is from today is also that this is not anymore a project of some particular countries. It is a project for the whole Europe. We know that the industrial base is different, the market economy structures are different, but it was mentioned that we have in several countries a huge majority of SMEs or even micro companies. It's true, but I just had a look on the internet again. Even in countries like Germany or Austria, we have more than 90, by far more than 90%, I think even 99.4% small and medium enterprises. So this is a structure and a problematic we are facing in all countries, and therefore I think it's also a reason why we need European answers. So once again, colleagues, thank you very much. To be continued, but it was very interesting. Thank you also to the interpreters for your flexibility. I very much appreciate this, and I wish you all now a good lunch break. Thanks a lot.